Hello and welcome to Rabble Report. I'm Grant. This is a channel where we look at the rising phenomenon of anti-politics. In our last episode, we discussed the decline of trust in political parties and how that has ultimately led to establishment parties around the world faltering, and here in the US, presidents like Obama and Trump as different politicians try out different ways to take advantage of this growing hostility to politics, left, right, and center. Today, we're going to look a bit at how that changes war.
I'm Joe.
I'm Bobby. Oh, sorry.
And today we have a very special guest as well. Bobby, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. Good to be here.
Bobby, you used to blog about the Middle East quite a bit, right? I think that's how we wound up discussing all this and bring you on.
Basically, yeah, you're right. I've been reading and writing about it for some time on and off. And I think it kind of started weirdly. I mean, it's a little bit of a cliche, but it's nonetheless true that I was in college when 9/11 happened. And it was mostly like, this is going to sound kind of funny, but I considered myself to be a relatively well-read person and aware of things about the world. And I was like, I don't really know anything about what caused whatever the hell just happened. And it just felt like a really huge blind spot in my education and in like my kind of intellectual life. So I sort of dove in at that time. And then, from there was just a bunch of kind of happy accidents. I guess you could, 9/11 wasn't a happy accident, of course, but there was other happy accidents along the way. Discovering Edward Said, for example. I interned at the small literary magazine, Arab Arts and Cultures magazine, things like that. And then so it just kind of took off from there.
Well, we're super excited to talk to you about Iran, Israel, and some of the context of how we got here, tie that into the global anti-political trend as well. But we've got two segments today that tie in. We're going to talk a little bit about Mamdani's victory in the New York City mayoral race before we get into the sort of so-called 12-day war. Last time we talked about Mamdani, the progressive candidate for mayor who just clinched the Democratic Party nomination in quite an upset. We, Joe and I had predicted that the Democratic Party's left wing could take advantage of discontent with the party establishment. But at the time, Mamdani himself wasn't polling great outside of Brooklyn, and it looked a little bit like it was going to be the same old story with some of these left progressive DSA adjacent candidates. And that's turned out really not to be the case. He's had pretty big success. And I want to talk a little bit later about the whole red terror reaction the Republican Party is having, like acting like he's Pol Pot, and why that's probably not the best strategy. But first, let's just start with what changed. What brought Mamdani from single digits outside of Brooklyn to overtaking Andrew Cuomo?
Well, it seems that he wasn't running a campaign that I think the left would have run a couple of years ago. He pretty ruthlessly lasered in on very pressing cost of living issues within New York. He isn't talking like he might have on Twitter 5 years ago, which, as you mentioned before, the right's dug up all of his old social media stuff. That all would seem slightly embarrassing now. But in his own campaign, he basically said, we're going to have free buses, publicly owned grocery stores.
Right. This is somebody who might have come off as an ideologue in the past based on his own words, but he seems to have run a much more disciplined campaign and lasered in on things that are a little more socially relevant than you might have expected.
I think there's some precedent for it too if you go back further, right? Maybe not in the, like sort of left liberal side, but didn't de Blasio run on free pre-K throughout the city? And people were like, yeah, you know what? That sounds like a great idea. So that bread and butter stuff being the focus, I think was a really big difference for sure.
I'll echo what you guys have already said, but I also want to note discontent with the party establishment. I mean, that was something we were tracking pretty early into this year, was just that Democrats were turning to the progressive faction, not entirely out of everyone suddenly becoming very left wing, but it was felt that that the center and the party establishment had just failed pretty miserably in the election and wasn't really mounting the kind of fight that Democratic voters wanted them to mount against the Trump administration. And so there was a lot of room for a factional shakeup and to exploit the mistrust that Democratic voters have right now in their own party. But yeah, also focusing on cost of living instead of cultural issues. Also, a small primary electorate could be a factor as well. You know, you've got the most motivated people in the Democratic Party coming out. That's going to skew a little bit more activist, a little more left wing.
The reaction to Mamdani later probably helped him, I would bet. The sort of 5-alarm freakout, political establishment coming out to against you.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I was going to say that, and I thought, I was going to hold the thought until maybe we, segued into talking about some of the, especially the right freak out. But I think, like, in the context of what you're saying, Joe, it makes a lot of sense. Even you saw it like in mainstream sort of press pushing this kind of like the anti-Semitism dimension, for example. Are you going to go visit Israel and all this kind of stuff? And I think it just really made it look like, again, like you said, like he's more disruptive than maybe he is on his own. But also, I think there was probably some reaction from the public of why are we listening to this? What does this have to do with the price of food in the Bronx? That's the kind of thing where people get this reactions. And I think that, to his credit, I think Mamdani handled it really well too. I think he handled it pretty gracefully. There was that segment that went around on social media when he was on the Colbert Report, or whatever this show is called now, Stephen Colbert. And Colbert asked him the question about, like, this is a city of the highest population of Jews outside of Tel Aviv. What do you say to people? And, he handled it. Mamdani answered it brilliantly. And then it kind of comes out afterwards that, or at least there's speculation that everyone at first was like, oh, why is Stephen Colbert asking this question? Like, what does this have to do with New York? But then there's speculation afterwards that they wanted him to ask this question so that he can have the opportunity to kind of, here, let me just lay out the case once and for all on the biggest platform that I'm going to have available to me, and let's put this to rest. I mean, that's, part of the thing too, is I think that we talk about some of these exogenous factors, but also the campaign he ran. But also, I think he's pretty adept, a kind of deft politician too.
Yeah, I think he actually did handle it quite a bit better than, say, Corbyn handled this.
Yeah.
Than 5-6 years ago. I actually thought that was pretty disastrous how that was handled in Britain. But one thing I do think that you can't compare with Corbyn is that wagon circling effect winds up backfiring. Mamdani, I think, I think he's diffused it for everybody that wanted him to answer that in a, I think, graceful or mild way.
Probably a more poised way than a lot of people in DSA, for example, would have counseled him to answer it. And so, I don't think the answer is going to make the people on the right wing happy, and I think the people on the left are going to take what they're getting here. But it's not really coming off as an extreme thing, which, again, there have been things, on October 7th, his statement was like mostly about freeing Palestine, for example, right? But in the context he's in, answering the questions he's being given, yeah, he's doing a good job.
Getting back to the Corbyn comparison, when Corbyn ran in 2017 and he looked down for the count, I think the fact that he was, how do I put this?
The way he was under siege.
Yeah, the way he was besieged by the Tories and by the media, less so Labour. I think Labour left him for dead. I think they were waiting for him to just be flushed out by the electorate. But the fact that they had this sort of frenzied campaign, making him out to be this big danger, it basically invited the public to kick the governing party in the ass. And I think that's kind of what happened with Mamdani here.
I think Mamdani is a great example of when you have a figure who's a bit disruptive and the trend in their favor, whether Mamdani, so we use this term anti-politician, and often an anti-politician is somebody who's using the anti-political mood consciously. I think it's questionable whether Mamdani counts as an anti-politician, but the anti-political trend itself within the Democratic Party could explain some of his rise, the discontent with the establishment there. But when you have that trend of, okay, anti-politics is influencing this race a little bit, it's kind of supercharging this, and then the establishment wagon circles somebody, you're almost giving them the power of anti-politics. no matter, even if they're not the most anti-political candidate they could be, even if they could push things a lot further and be more attuned to that social mood, you're kind of giving them that without them even having to work for it in a lot of ways.
Right. And I think if Mamdani does realize that and he runs with that from here on out into his, assuming he makes it into Gracie Mansion, Mayor's Mansion in New York, he could float. That might, even if he can't really get much through city council, that could still keep him a relevant figure and maybe even get him reelected.
Well, what would that actually, I think I know what you mean, but what would that actually look like in your eyes? What would
I think it would be fighting the city establishment, fighting even people in his own party still.
This is the sort of like Tea Party thing we were talking about earlier, right? Which is that he's got to continue to fight inside. It's going to be challenging, but I think the thing that's interesting is that, like, and again, like we may pick up on some of this later, but some of the things that he's, I mean, I don't know about the rent-free stuff, but some of the other stuff is pretty modest. That's the other thing that's so interesting about the circling of the wagons from the liberal side, from the Democratic side. It's like, well, what do you think this guy's going to do? It's not clear to me that he's got this extreme agenda. Again, that makes him appear even more disruptive. It's a question of whether he continues that going forward. I think he's got, if I'm not mistaken, the mayor has a lot of sort of power over rent stuff in New York that he can do independently. I think for some of the other stuff, I mean, it's clearly going to be something he's going to have to navigate the city council, which is going to be his, fighting with his own, well, with the Democratic Party primarily. So
yeah, I think it helps that he threw some deregulatory
Yep.
elements into his campaign as well, not just kind of big government stuff, but also saying let's make it easier to open a halal cart.
Right.
I mean,
Totally.
that's something I think a New Yorker can get behind.
I was going to actually ask you guys after Joe finished talking about, I mean, do you guys think that the way that we're discussing it kind of, I mean, and I haven't thought about it too much, but there's echoes of Sanders in 16 also. I mean, to me, part of the difference between Sanders in 16 and Sanders in 20 was that I think that in 20, he got a little bit more involved in some of the cultural stuff the second time around. I don't think it defined the campaign totally, but I think it was definitely more of an influence. Whereas the first time around, it was sort of that more of that bread and butter stuff, and that he captured that kind of anti-political mood of the moment. Did you guys see any of that?
Well, I mean, first off, I would agree that 2016 to 2020 Bernie is a shift from being more of an independent outside the party figure to being more of a party factional figure. But
yeah,
Joe, what do you think?
I think too, Cuomo is actually very comparable to Clinton. You have a wounded line of the party establishment.
Yeah.
That's slightly tainted. And somebody like Mamdani or Sanders, they could be pretty decent foils to that, actually, even if they're not anti-politicians.
Right.
So, speaking of Cuomo, it does seem like he felt a bit entitled to win, and he was polling very well at first, and he sort of just sleepwalks into this loss. I mean, do either of you remember anything about his campaign?
I feel like there were quite a bit of advertising dollars that were thrown into his campaign, but I don't know if that's a game changer that it used to be. I kind of wonder how much Cuomo's campaigning is stuck in the 90s in a way. And that might even get at like how much he's a Clintonite old guard figure.
There was definitely a sense of entitlement. Like, that's why I think that there's such kind of interesting parallels.
I do find it interesting that Mamdani basically won everyone but the Upper West and East Side and denizens of the New York City Housing Authority.
Yeah.
That's an odd coalition.
It is.
Or it's very catch-all in a certain way.
Yeah, it's funny because I put that graph on Facebook with the question, like, did the socialist candidate win the workers though? And I keep getting people telling me that, like, yes, he did. I'm like, are you sure? Oh yeah, it was deep into Queens. I was like, yeah, well, it's Queens. Of course Queens is going to vote that way. But I mean, it was in Manhattan that he won, right?
I think he won every borough except Bronx and Staten Island.
Staten Island, yeah.
And obviously, it's a pretty low turnout primary because that's urban politics in general. I mean,
yeah,
it's higher than like previous Democratic primaries have been historically, but that isn't really saying much. I think I pointed out even that in the 1930s, double the amount of people would vote in New York mayoral elections. And what does that say about politics?
Right.
But I do think that Mamdani had to win by getting some cross-section of working-class voters.
It's a fragmented kind of outcome in a lot of ways. It's not neatly mappable onto class one way or the other. And then you've got a pretty small amount of voters. You don't actually have that many people voting in this election. So even though it can reflect the way anti-politics has touched the Democratic Party, it doesn't necessarily mean that society more broadly than that has sort of chosen Mamdani as its champion of anti-politics in this case. What is it, 1 million people voting in this primary? That's not a lot of people in New York City.
It does remind me of the Tea Party in a sense. People weren't really invested in the high ideological zeal of the Tea Party, but they didn't really stand in the way of it punishing the Republican establishment. And Obama a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. People might not necessarily be all in on the ideological elements of a campaign, but they are interested in punishing the establishment
Right.
in a lot of ways. And that applies to left populism, right populism. We often try to read on society, like we project onto society, when the right wins, for example, it's, oh my God, society's becoming so nationalistic. We're so conservative now. And then when the left wins, it's like everybody's a socialist now.
Yeah, Trump is probably the example par excellence, but when you really look at it closely, it's like, well, clearly he's also got this kind of, I wouldn't say fragmented ideologically, but it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, right? And that seems to increasingly, I think, be the case, maybe in general, but certainly it's something these kind of disruptive politicians can take advantage of, right? Is that they can appeal to, I mean, I hate to be sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for, quotidian about it, but common sense stuff, again, with the bread and butter thing, like this makes sense. Okay, sure, maybe this is a conservative talking point. It's talking about deregulation, too many permits, let's bring the price down, but makes sense to a bunch of people. And so does, hey, it'd be really killer if we could take the bus for free also, right? It's just stuff people can relate to, and it's not ideological fundamentally.
And I think the right's reaction, the sort of red terror response that they're having sort of autonomically, this just kind of impulse
Right.
that they have to have, that they've sort of fallen into, it doesn't really address any of the reasons that all of that stuff was appealing to people. There's no real answer to it. In terms of what a successful response to Mamdani would be, it wouldn't be, you're going to turn New York City into a socialist hellhole. It would be, do you really think this guy can get all that done? Or is he making false promises? That's a lot more of a comeback to what Mamdani is doing. And it actually is a specific response to his campaign, a counter, would be to try something like that. Would be to actually talk about the plausibility and raise the kind of governance issues that could come up for a left-wing politician.
Right, because I feel like that's something even Cuomo could have impressed me. Like, you might have mixed feelings about me, but you can trust me to be able to govern. I can handle power. I can handle all this special interests in New York. Do you trust a 33-year-old Dale kid to do that? Not
Right,
that hard,
right.
but I think the thing is, you want to treat Mamdani as kind of a harmless guy with a couple of good ideas, but still kind of a crank. But not like this sort of not the sort of McCarthyite Red Menace type thing.
Yeah. I mean, the right's going, I mean, in the discourse, it's nuts. I mean, it's just, it's not just communist stuff. It's like Sharia law and all this kind of thing too, right? It's absolutely, I mean, and that was the funny thing, is going back to that, like, because he had posted this thing about like the halal carts, right, that we were talking about earlier. And if you just were to see, like, if you didn't watch the actual video, and it's just like the thing that he posted with the caption, like, it wasn't make halal great again. I don't have it in front of me, but make halal great again would have been fucking fantastic as a slogan. But it was something more along the lines of like make halal cheap or something like it, whatever it was, right? And so the right saw this and they didn't bother to look at the video, and they're like, look at this guy, he wants to halalize all of New York City or whatever, when really it was like, it's expensive to get a permit every year, and so the shawarma's more expensive than it needs to be. Deregulation, classic kind of conservative trope. But the other thing that I was going to say, and this is as much a question to you guys as anything else, I wonder how much of this, like, Joe, I think you're absolutely right that the real response is, can he govern? Does he have not just the experience and the wherewithal to sort of navigate New York City politics, but does he have the connections? Does he have the base of supporters who are in positions that can influence constituencies, people who are vested interests, all that kind of stuff, right? That goes into regular governance. But I wonder too, like how much this is a reflection, and this I think is part of the anti-political theme. How much of this is a reflection of this disconnect of the sort of political valence, thinking that the solution is it's not just better politics, but it's better politicians. And so if you could just plug the right person in who just has the beliefs that you have, then somehow shit's going to get done. And it totally, does not take into account like the realities of interest, the material basis for power, the various competing power centers in any given jurisdiction or constituency. We just don't talk about that. Like, like for example, like, okay, let's say Bernie Sanders had one. He would have to have 1,000 executive orders, to do any of the stuff that the DSA or the left really hoped that he would, right? That's just the reality of it.
Right. Like, do you have a social base to override vested interests at a given point? Which, Mamdani doesn't.
This ties into even our last episode where we talked about the book Ruling the Void. If you have mass politics and mass political parties declining, and you don't have social movements that are entering politics, be it, to make a political objective or antagonistically against politics in a certain way, well, what mass of people in society are you going to leverage to break those special interests? And that has a lot of limitations of what the state can actually do to solve social problems. Because if it's just the state acting alone and there's no mass social movement like what we saw with the civil rights movement or the workers' movement in the 19th century, early 20th century, there's just not that wedge to break down those entrenched interests. And people in politics think they can do it. They think they have power because they have the power of the state. But
right,
it's a lot more complicated than that.
Could he uphold like a sort of popular authority if he acted as that disruptor?
Right, within the political sphere, yeah.
Could his approvals hold up doing that? Maybe. If he had more of an anti-political sense. That being said, I don't know. I do think that he sort of views this as sort of or he views his mayoral campaign and possibly his tenure as mayor coming up as a sort of Trojan horse for an ascending faction within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I don't know if those ideological commitments from him have gone away. And that's probably going to be his biggest self-thwarting element. That could creep back up on him. And it seems like a tendency he may have, unless he's learned a lot over the last 5 years.
I thought it was interesting that even Trump is now intervening in the race, kind of. Because right. I think he might view Mamdani as potentially a foil because of his ideological commitments. So you call him a communist and hope that Mamdani will take the bait and rant about fascism or whatever. I guess he can rally the Democratic base behind him if he fights Trump, including on immigration. Maybe he could show up his authority as like Trump's, favorite foil. Does that make you a disruptive figure anymore, really, though? Not really.
Well, if you're Trump's favorite foil, aren't you the new Gavin Newsom?
Basically.
Right.
Which I think that's where any trace of social content in the political form of Mamdani goes to die, is being Gavin Newsom 2.0. So we'll see. And there are ways to counter what he's doing, but the whole red terror thing the Republicans are trying to run that's not the counter campaign. That's not it.
No.
And I guess too, there's a capriciousness to it as well. And I think that's even why a lot of these attacks from the political center on Mamdani don't really land, because the left is capricious and loony. Okay, maybe they have a point, but this is coming from Cuomo.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, as far as the right's looniness goes, they're going to paint you as a communist, as Chairman Mao 2.0, no matter what. But the right got a special treat this time, right? Because he's not just a communist, he's a Muslim communist. He's a Shia. He's a 12er Shia. And so they got an extra treat this time around because now it's and I love it because like I almost wanted to start like replying to people who were talking about how he's a Islamist. It's funny, Islamist communist or whatever. Like there's all these like you just plugging the terms in together and seeing what comes out. But I almost wanted to start sending them quotes from. Do you guys know Ali Shariati? Have you guys heard of Ali Shariati? I think Joe, you and I might have talked about Shariati before because he kind of was an Islamist communist in some ways. I mean, that was kind of Shariati's whole thing. But yeah, it's an extra treat that they get this time for their looniness.
Is this how we tie things into Iran now?
That's what I was thinking. That's what I was kind of trying to throw you one right over the plate.
In the Iranian Revolution, there was a communist faction. I mean, that's kind of an interesting, underappreciated element of, as the Shah was deposed, there were a lot of things that could have happened in Iran.
Yeah, and it didn't go that way, obviously. There was, I mean, it's the history is long and convoluted, but there were definitely outcomes that could have been different. My understanding of the history is that the Islamist factions, with Khomeini and the communists did have some mutual interests, and the primary one, of course, was deposing the Shah, and there was cooperation, and there was a sense that there was even schisms within the communists in Iran as to whether or not they should try to foment the revolution themselves and take it over, or whether there was room to cooperate with the rising Shia clerics at the time. Obviously, ultimately, Khomeini, turned on the communists to the extent that they did, and completed the kind of takeover of the clerical regime there. And then from there, you just had quick consolidation. I think that the Iran-Iraq war certainly helped to solidify, ironically, the regime, even if that was counterproductive to what the U.S. and Saddam thought at the time. But it did end up, and it ends up being like a very important piece of not just Iranian identity, like modern identity, but really the revolutionary identity and the identity of the revolutionary state, of the clerical state, that it's literally drenched in the blood of the martyrs, right? So it allows them to continue this kind of narrative that goes back to really the beginning of the Shia-Sunni split in a lot of ways. If that's an important narrative for Twelver Shiism. So yeah, I mean, it could have gone a different way, and now we see where it ended up.
Well, and the Iranian regime has had quite a good deal of authority within the country for decades since. I mean, it really has only started to unravel recently in very surface level ways, even though they had problems and there was a general sense. I think there's been a sense in Iran for some time of people being open to change, but because of the way Iranians want it on their own terms, a lot of the options for regime change, which are often externally imposed, don't appeal to them. And so the regime might not always have the most popularity. It might have internal problems. It might have to crush dissent, but it's been able to maintain authority and looked, at least internally, strong until the last 5, maybe 10 years. Would you say that's accurate?
I think that's right. Again, going back and kind of taking the history into account, like it's important to know that, like, because of the Shah and because of, I mean, you go back as far as Mossadegh and this idea that the Iranians felt victimized for a long time, and that Khomeini really was a sort of like moment for the Iranians to say, like, okay, we're going to get some of our sovereignty back, we're going to get some of our self-determination back, and this kind of thing. And that even at the very, very beginning, like, we look at it now and say, oh, it's an oppressive regime, it's a theocratic regime, and all this kind of stuff. For a lot of people, they, we often talk about in the United States, for example, like believing in this experiment of self-governance, right? There was a lot of Iranians who for a very long time believed in the project of the revolution. They believed that, okay, we can have a kind of modern Islamic state, we can do this. And the state itself, I think, over time has it's not always, I mean, I don't want to trivialize the sort of oppression of women and some of these things that happen. It's certainly the case, but they've actually shown a lot of flex too. They've shown a lot of flexibility over time. It ebbs and flows, this notion. I mean, I think the mistake that people make that aren't as well attuned to what goes on over there is that it's basically Afghanistan, that it's like a Taliban kind of regime. It's not. I mean, it's never been that. It's a relatively well developed country. It's a middle income country. I mean, the sanctions regime has harmed that, of course, over time, but it's socially, it's not quite Turkey, but it's probably closer to that than something like Afghanistan, clearly. And I think in recent years in particular, the regime has tried to wager this bargain with the population, which is that if you don't give us too much grief, we'll let the headscarf slip a little bit further back on the head. We'll let you guys have Instagram, some of those kinds of social concessions. I was actually just reading in anticipation of talking to you guys. I was looking at some other stuff, and there was actually a thing where there's the Basij, which is the kind of morality police, whatever. They had some rules in place to enforce some of these social mores, like I think it was specifically around the hijab and things like that. And the supreme leader and some of his coterie actually told them, like, just don't enforce it for a while. This is relatively recent, again, because they're trying to make these kinds of concessions. I hate to sort of be cliche about it, but I think a lot of the discontent really comes back to economic factors, right? Which is that the Iranians, especially these kinds of like Western oriented middle class Iranians and lower middle class Iranians in particular, they see themselves falling behind, right? They see Turkey, they see India, they see Malaysia, Indonesia, places like that, and they feel like they're falling behind. And that's creating, I think, a lot of the tension that you see now. I don't want to dismiss the sort of cultural policing stuff. I think it's significant, but I think that if you were really going to have a kind of boiling over situation, it would be because the Iranian regime spent all this time and treasure trying to set up the axis of resistance, which we will get into, and the Iranians don't feel like they got anything out of it.
All of those countries that you're talking about that are doing better than Iran economically, it's not that they're all best friends with the West, but they have normalized relations.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is part of the thing, is that there's a little bit of a parallel here when we talk about the rejection of like we talk about like people don't want forever wars in the US anymore and all this kind of thing, right? And I think you guys tell me if you agree with this, but I think a lot of it is basically, what the hell did we get for all of it? We didn't get anything out of fighting these wars for 20 years, right? And I can't afford groceries or whatever the case is. I mean, I think the Iranians feel very similarly. If you look at the polling, and I think there was a poll that Joe showed us, that the sort of support for regimes in Yemen and Lebanon, whatever the case is, for these proxies or whatever, the idea of supporting them is good, but the idea of supporting them financially, that's when the polling starts to fall off, right? When you ask them, like, do you want to, are you cool with us supporting it? They're like, no. Why? It's not getting us anything, and we're not getting ahead ourselves, right? So I think this is like a major kind of issue. And of course, we could talk about the sort of way that the regime has basically been embarrassed in this most recent conflict.
It seems too to me that Iran is actually fairly isolated now in the region.
Yeah.
Even if they have states that are okay with them, the only, I think I showed a poll where like the only in Pakistan do a majority of people, at least as of 2022,
Yeah.
approve of Iran's influence in their country.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, like if you think about something like Lebanon, for example, right? When we talk about the axis of resistance and all this effort that was put into putting up the Hezbollah,
Can you
might
just define? Can
Yeah.
you just define just to get on the same page with everybody in our audience, the axis of resistance?
Sure. So I think that the best way to describe the axis of resistance is that the Iranians pursued a strategy whereby they would have these kind of regional proxies in various places. So primarily we're talking about the Hezbollah, Hamas in Palestine, the Houthis in Yemen, and then there's various kind of Iraqi militias that are aligned with Tehran. And so the idea behind the axis of resistance was, we'll have these proxies, and the proxies will basically serve as a deterrent to Israel. So if Israel acts in any one of these regions, the other proxies, will be able to step in, and this will be the deterrent threat, right? As has been shown, this completely failed, basically. And so, like, if you, again, taking the example of like a place like Lebanon, for example, so the proxy there is the Hezbollah, and so they were spending a lot of treasure supporting Hezbollah, a lot of logistical support, all this kind of thing. And, you know, the Hezbollah also wanted to enter into politics. They didn't want to just remain like what they were in the 80s and 90s, which was basically like a militant movement. They entered politics, and they weren't terribly successful at that. There was some exogenous factors. I mean, the Lebanese economy was tanked, and there was like that port explosion. There was a lot of things, and a lot of this, you know, the stuff that fell to the feet of Hezbollah, they just weren't capable of governing around some of that stuff. And so if you're in Lebanon and you have this party that's coming in making all these promises and they're failing, and you're going to go look at like, well, you know, the Iranians are propping these people up or taking up seats, you know, for potentially people who could be solving our problems. I can see how the resentment might come. I was actually interested in that poll that you showed because I couldn't even say off the top of my head why there's support in Pakistan. The only thing I could speculate is that maybe there's some sentiment in Pakistan that it can be part of some kind of China, Pakistan, Iran thing to counter India, and you know some of this. But I mean, Pakistan's a Sunni country. That one was a little bit of a mystery to me. I mean, I think that's probably it's some kind of geopolitical thing primarily, but yeah.
They probably have shared interests on preventing separatism too.
Yeah. I mean, this was you know, like what you shared that tweet from that guy called at Iran Wonk, and he mentioned like the worst case scenario for Iran, which was, you know, some kind of Iraq 2.0 situation where the country falls apart in the face of a ground invasion, which clearly is not going to happen. But if it did, you know, the point is that there probably wouldn't be these kinds of, you know, this heavy separatism in the periphery, but the Baloch case might be the one. I mean, maybe I think the Azeris are pretty well integrated, actually. I think the Baloch case might be the one place where you would see, because the Baloch tried it in Pakistan for a lot of years. I think they're still trying it, but they're just not terribly successful, to have like some kind of separatism or, you know, assert some kind of independent right or something like that. So you may see that across the board.
Give us a little drop of context on who you're talking about.
Yeah, so in Iran is like, you know, primary. This is what Ted Cruz should have been able to say to Tucker Carlson, apparently, right? So Iran is primarily a Persian country, right? It's, I think 65% it's ethnically Persian, and then you have this admixture of these different groups. So you have Azeris, Kurds, Armenians, and in the bit of the country that borders around like Afghanistan and Pakistan, you have the Baloch. And so the Baloch in Pakistan have been on and off fighting an insurgency with I mean, it's never, I think the period that it was most kind of crazy was in the 90s. It hasn't really picked up much, but they are a group that has expressed some interest in some kind of independent state, or at least, you know, maybe some federated rights or something like that in Pakistan. So there is the possibility, I guess, that the Baloch in Iran have a similar feeling if the government were to collapse or something like that. I mean, other than that, I don't really see it.
What was the relationship between the Axis of Resistance and the development of that, and the initial Iran deal that, you know, JCPOA that Obama implemented and then got torn up by Trump in 2017? How does that all tie together?
You mean in terms of like whether or not the axis of resistance was in response to that, or like accelerating the resistance was part of that? Or
yeah, was there like an accelerated was there an acceleration of investment and interest in it after JCPOA got torn up?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the axis of resistance has probably been the Iranian project for at least 10 years, probably longer, obviously. But I think that there was probably definitely like a case like, yeah, of accelerating that. I think the other thing about tearing up JCPOA is it kind of got us to the place that we were here. I haven't seen a good, I mean, you guys might know, but I haven't seen a good reason why you should have 60% enriched uranium other than to turn it into 90% enriched uranium. And I think that only happens when you tear up the JCPOA. And so, you know, you have that taking place in parallel to trying to solidify the axis of resistance. I think the big challenge that Iran had with the axis of resistance is that you had these parties that, with the Hezbollah and Hamas in particular, that were entering into politics, right? Or were already entered into politics. And so, you know, these are organizations that have social services. They're governing in various ways. They have an administrative capacity, and that actually I think creates like more like operational security issues. I think the Houthis, for example, like operate a little bit differently. They operate a little bit more like, I mean, they control quite a bit of territory and they do have some administrative functions, but I think they operate a little bit more like a militant group. And so, you know, Israeli, you know, good on them. Israeli, like Mossad and intelligence, they totally penetrated all these organizations, right? And knew exactly where the leadership was, knew exactly who to take out, and you know, it was shown to be quite brittle. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a failed project, and it really exposed. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway from the 12 days of the conflict from the Iranian side is that it really exposed the weakness. It exposed that the axis of resistance was really like pretty flawed project. And it also left us with a big question, which is where does the regime go from here?
So to speak about those 12 days a little bit, we'll kind of rewind. We've talked a little bit about how did we get to here with Iran, and then what are the questions Iran is looking at next. In the middle, we have this Israel and Iran. You know, they trade some strikes. Israel takes out a lot of top Iranian military figures. Trump steps in to bomb key Iranian nuclear facilities and then call the whole thing off in a way that just pulls the rug out from under warhawks in Israel, in the Republican Party, in the Democratic Party. You know, and things could change still, right? It's a very fragile ceasefire in a lot of ways, but then we also don't see what incentives there are to break it from the Iranian side because they're looking quite weak right now. You know, maybe it's the Israelis, but then they've got Trump is actually making quite a thing of them needing to stop. But, you know, this was a very strange war when you compare expectations against reality. You know, what do you think of, first off, what do you guys think of the Israeli operation, right? Like, why did it happen when it did? How successful was it? The US stepping in. Let's just go over the events themselves, and then we can figure out how does this tie into the show's theme of anti-politics and look at the different political actors and in more that lens. Maybe what we can talk about a little bit is what were the Israeli targets? Because it wasn't just the nuclear facilities, and why did they choose the targets they chose?
Well, they went pretty hard on the IRGC, didn't they?
They did.
That was actually like the main target of their assassinations.
And then there was also nuclear scientists. Those were like the primary targets of the initial decapitation strikes.
The IRGC, how do we define the IRGC? They're not the Iranian army.
It's the Revolutionary Guard, right?
Correct.
Pulled the strings on a lot of the Iranian economy too, I think, especially with the sanctions regime. The sanctions regime in a lot of ways has made the IRGC stronger in regards to its pull on the state and even Iranian civil society. Does that sound right to you, Bobby? That's from
that's absolutely right. And I think that's why the sense is that if there was some kind of, and you know, again, it's a big open question, but if you were able to destabilize the current regime enough with this kind of, you know, rocket attrition, for lack of a better way of describing it, if you were able to wobble them enough, the likely successor to like a clerical regime is the IRGC, I would say. Just because they, you know, they do have that kind of material control of various, you know, power bases in the country already.
Well, and it also seems like the Israelis were not just showing we can take out your nuclear program, they were showing we can diminish your state capacity, which ties into this.
It's true. It's true. I you know, I was thinking about this yesterday, and I wonder if it's actually like, I wonder if like the reality, like talking about expectations versus reality, is if the targeting, what they were able to do and what they sort of weren't able to do on their own, is that you're actually better at taking out, doing assassinations than you are at, say, a war of rocket attrition, because they're going to run out of arrow. They can't sustain the same level of casualties as maybe the Iranians are willing to. But what you can do is use Mossad to target exactly where these individuals are, send the coordinates back home, blah blah blah. They're actually really good at that, and maybe not as good as at the other stuff. Because I don't think the Israelis could really sustain this for very long either if they wanted to. And I think that's the other thing. It was so impressive at first, and then it started to look like, oh, okay, maybe we got to back off here too, because we're literally gonna run out of stuff. There's no sausage factory for the Arrow 3 missile, right?
Well, doesn't that tie things too into our show's theme of anti-politics? Because you're seeing the mutual weakness and limitation for all of the political classes involved, and the ways that society and society's mistrust of its own political leadership, its own quote unquote political leadership and its representatives, that it actually constrains their ability to conduct war now, maybe more than ever.
Right, I agree with that.
I totally agree with that.
Like, I think the thing is too really is Israel is fairly casualty sensitive. I think they realize that too. I think that's also why they wound up having to draw back a little bit.
Yeah, it's on the Israeli side, it's that casualty sensitivity. On the Iranian side, there's like a loss of authority for the regime. Both of those things. And then on the US side, right? Why does Trump decide that this is not a regime change war, that this is a surgical strike? In all three cases, I think you've got pressure from society on the political class, whether it's direct or implicit.
You're not taking this all the way to the mats, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we might have chatted about this before too, but and not to get too sidetracked, but I think that it's worth saying in this context. It just seems like I mean, Gaza's a weird, I don't want to say weird, I don't want to trivialize it, but Gaza seems to be this exception. But the appetite for political violence in general just seems to be is it kind of at an all-time low, like in the modern period? I mean,
right. Well, people talk about our time like it's the most politically violent time ever. I mean,
it's clearly not.
If you look at the statistics, right? There was somebody on Twitter who was sharing this, like the number of bombings and plane hijackings and all this stuff that was going on in the 1970s. I mean, that's not like, you have a few politically motivated killings in the US. And I think we're actually so sensitive to it now that it becomes a viral story whenever there's a politically motivated shooting in the United States or a political terrorist attack in the United States. And even those are often esoteric and involve mental health and things like that as well. But really, just numerically, political violence within society is down in places that are stable,
I think there's something about how this ties into even the ability to engage in like a limited war, even where you're not like drafting tons of people to go send them into, like obviously we're not going to be drafting 19-year-old conscripts to go into tanks and send them to Iran. That's not going to happen. But even I have to wonder how this even ties into like the efficacy of these states in terms of being able to build a military industry to sustain a long conflict. We're not really able to do that. Even the United States isn't really able to do that. Like everything is built around short-term wars, really. I mean, Israel and Iran were running out of materiel within not even days. 2 weeks. Yeah,
absolutely.
And can you really mobilize society to like to have a military industry that could sustain a years-long conflict like that now?
Yeah, I mean, like we talk about like NATO rearmament, right? And Trump trying to push the EU to spend more or whatever. Does Europe even have the industrial capacity to do that anymore? I mean, I mean, it's not just industrial capacity; it's like know-how and all that kind of stuff too, right? But yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there just seem to be limits to this, and if you're not going to invade a country, right, then you're not going to ultimately be able to dictate terms. I think that's what we saw here, right? Is that the limits of the powers that I think what Trump did was pretty deft. At the same time, it shows the limits. You're not going to be able to ultimately dictate terms unless you're willing to go in and clear out the palace.
Well, and that goes to like the differences between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Trump is a realist about American decline.
Yeah.
It's a theme in his speeches in certain ways. And I think in a way that's almost Obama-esque as well. You know, Obama as well was very keen on the need to draw back the war on terror. That's why you have that shift from these ground invasions to technologically
Yeah.
mediated drone warfare, things like that. You know, it's not non-violence. We're not going to see that from the United States, like, or any state. I'm not even picking
Yeah.
on the US, but um, but you do see this pulling back, right? And so that can bring us to, you know, American imperial decline. And we should define what we're talking about when we say American imperial decline and hegemony and pulling back and all those things, because it's old hat to us. But I think it's worth reiterating for ourselves even too. But also, like, so Trump, you know, like Biden, okay. The Biden administration came off very asleep at the wheel in terms of its Middle East policy, in terms of its geopolitics generally. And part of the reason for that is they seemed to exist in a fantasy where the United States was still this unipolar dominant power over everything and could just exert its will. Whereas Trump, because he's very aware of the limitations of US power, he's much more able to manage the optics of something like this. So like you said, Bobby, like it's like you could say on the one hand, oh, he's a deal maker, right? He's also well suited to the moment because deal making is all the US can do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, when we talk about decline, American decline, I think the important sort of way to to sort of describe it or to distinguish, you know, various like ways of thinking about this is relative decline, right? So there's absolute decline. We could probably discuss if you guys, you know, think that that's, you know, something that's happening. But I think the relative decline is, to me, the more interesting part, which is that, I mean, not to go again, not to digress too much, but I think it's important. It's like if you think about China, right? Um, there's no what does a shooting war over Taiwan look like? It's not going to happen, right? I mean, China doesn't have to be at the exact same level as us. It needs to be near peer competitor for us to get to a certain point where, you know, the trade-offs are just simply too high, right? But you see it in smaller states too. Like again, like with Israel and Iran, you have a situation where we may not have known about the weakness to this extent of Iran, but I think that there was people, observers, who had a pretty clear understanding of, you know, Israeli capability, right? It's an advanced technological state. They pour tons of money into research. They pour tons of money into things like, you know, Unit 8200 is like the best cyber warfare on the planet. They get the best weapons, all this kind of. We kind of knew that. There's still a level at which it's going to you're absolutely limited in terms of what you can do, and so deal making ends up being the way to go. And you know, if we talk about anti-politics as something that, I don't know, it doesn't necessarily start with Obama, but Obama was sort of a precursor to this, if not an anti-politician himself. That's what the JCPOA was, right? It was a way to get around this problem of we're just not going to be able to project power sufficiently enough because the rest of the world, it's kind of, you know, those ballistic missiles, maybe they have hypersonic missiles, they're going to be able to extract the cost to us that's just simply going to be too high for us to sustain, whether it's, you know, materially or just because of public sentiment or whatever the case may be. And so that relative decline, I think, is what forces us into a situation where you can get an anti-politician like Trump, who I think one of the aspects of his anti-political nature is that he can be creative, right? He doesn't have to follow the imperatives of the blob directly, or the foreign policy establishment, whatever it is. He can be creative. He can use force in this way that's art of the deal kind of use of military force, basically, right? It's to leverage someone to the table or whatever the case is. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this is what I mean when I talk about relative decline.
Yeah, I mean, it
I
makes
think
sense,
too.
right? That the United States doesn't have to collapse to be in
Right.
a different relationship to its rival powers or to smaller states. You know, that the relative relationship between them changes. Um,
I think
yeah,
too, though, there's sort of a this talks about what we talked about before too. Anti-politics in itself forces this kind of decline across the board, really. Not
Mhm.
even, but the less that you can tie the public into the idea of this national project or the defense of the nation.
Yep. Like, well, what are you going to do? You're not going to
Right.
draft these kids. It's not going to happen.
Right. It creates problems. And it's
Yeah.
been creating problems for over 50 years now.
Yeah.
The draft was a problem, obviously, during Vietnam. I guess maybe a weird exception, because we were talking about that before, actually. What about Russia? And obviously Ukraine, they could start a draft because they were getting invaded. That's a little bit different, I think.
Yeah.
But I think you can shock society into action when that happens, I think.
Yeah,
But,
I think the invasion aspect of it is definitely a big part. I mean, as far as the Russians go, they had to increase multiple times. They had to increase the pay to get soldiers to come to the front. I mean, you could almost say they were bribing them. I mean, it was that desperate of a situation.
Right,
And-
they're going to get
and-
mates.
Prisoners.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's not a sign of like a lot of social buy-in to your project, right?
It isn't. I think too, like they have been, they actually have been trying to like elevate their military industry as like this bigger thing because they've had to, for one, just to keep up with the war. But even that's starting to like, I think, strain their economy a bit. And I do wonder, like, I do wonder if even this war is going to, even without like if there isn't technically a draft universally, I don't think, for this war in Russia, is there? I don't think there is.
No,
No.
it's a recruiting drive, and like I
Right.
said, they have to like increase the incentives for people to sign up, but it's not a formal like conscription.
Right. So even with that though, like I could see there being a lot of, I could still see this putting strain on Russia as a society over time. And we're already probably seeing that in terms of its economics, even.
So I don't want to get too far off the beaten path.
Yeah, no, of course.
Of our agenda here. So, but this is quite relevant, right? To what Bobby was saying about and what we were all really talking about, the inability to get that social buy-in and the chaotic kind of narratives that came out of that, right? Because one thing we were talking about is how out of sync the various political actors were, right? You had, and also what Bobby was saying about, the distinction where because Obama and Trump, Obama also had a little bit more of an antagonistic relationship with the foreign policy establishment, just as Trump did. So Obama, even though he was more of a technocratic manifestation of 21st century anti-politics than a rogue kind of populist tinged the way Trump is, Obama and Trump both had a more antagonistic relationship with the foreign policy establishment. And you see that on display here in this 12-day war. You have these out of sync political actors. You have, the hawks, Ted Cruz, Graham in Israel, Netanyahu out there saying some things, and then the signals from the administration were completely different. Like it seemed like, Bobby, you could probably speak to this more, but like there were people in American politics kind of out on their own trying to get buy-in for this bigger war.
Yeah, no, I mean it was, and I think that it was funny because like they kind of just rolled out the Iraq 2.0 script. It was a lot of the same language. There's going to be a mushroom cloud over New York if we don't do something. They got. I mean, they didn't say yellow cake, but they may as well have. And then there was also like an Ahmed Chalabi 2.0, right? In Reza Pahlavi, they started rolling out there. So that was happening, but it was so funny to me because I think the thing that I was like, especially like if you think about like the Tucker Carlson stuff, right? So there were like these few dissenting voices on the right, and maybe even within like MAGA or whatever. You had Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, there's a couple other people, and they kept on saying like no more wars. We voted for no more wars and all this kind of stuff, and I found myself wondering. I was like, what do you guys mean by war here exactly? Because it's clear that Trump is probably going to do something. He's going to use the military, use force for leverage in some sense. If you're talking about a ground invasion. Yeah, like nobody wants that, but it's not clear that that's what the administration is signaling, right? So there were these, kind of two things going on, and then you had these, at least in the discourse, you had these arguments taking place on the right as to like, should we trust Trump, but no more wars and all this kind of stuff, without really specifying what the administration had in mind, what the options were to be a little bit creative in this situation. Why did we think that the only thing that was going to happen was World War III? It wasn't clear to me. It was just all these kind of rogue voices. And, as Joe, I love this expression that Joe gave me, which is the Dr. Strangelove caucus of the Republican Party, right? Yeah, they were all for it, but it wasn't clear that anyone was even suggesting that this stuff was on the table. So
right. You had
yeah.
all these GOP figures who were kind of wish casting onto the Trump administration, like all these people who've wanted war with Iran for 20 years,
right,
were really excited. And they were, like you said, they were kind of, I think you used the word speed running. They were speed running a very lazy version of like the Iraq generic Middle East war script.
Yeah.
But then the actual center of power in the Trump administration was signaling things a lot more ambiguously. There was the regime change stuff was on the table, but it was also, there was this clear theatrical engagement with Iran of like, okay, go along with this, we'll do that, you do that. They literally coordinated with Iran the counterattack on ourselves, on our U.S. base. They're
yeah, and you see this before too, actually. When they assassinated Soleimani, I think it was the same thing.
It was the same thing.
Yeah.
But when they assassinated Soleimani, it was the same memes coming out of like the political discourse was like World War III's here.
And you know what's funny about that? Just because the Iranians actually did that too. So like there's like this, it was when Soleimani was assassinated, I forget what shrine it was, but there's a important shrine in Iran, I think it's in Isfahan, and they rolled out this red banner, and I think on the banner it says like every day is Karbala, every land is Karbala or something like that, and that was like the Iranian meme version of like it's going down, like, oh, we've rolled out the red banner of Ali, it's time, and then it was like, okay, so you guys got the coordinates, everyone's gone, right? Okay, cool. We'll lob the missiles now. I mean, it was total theater. Absolute theater.
Well, it also goes to show too the way Trump giving Israel and the right what they want undermined its own foundations as a political football, right? Like all of these figures, these bloodthirsty figures in the left and the right, because there's Democrats who, the Democrats in Congress were making a lot of noise about like Trump doesn't have war powers to unilaterally invade.
We need to approve it.
They all supported going to war. So the Democrats in Congress just wanted the right to vote in favor of whatever the Trump administration was going to do.
Yeah.
They still wanted to go to war with Iran. They were just like, let me vote for it.
Right. And I think it too, like I think the anti-war left was also licking their chops a bit too.
And yeah, I agree. But if you look at it too, like by resolving it in this kind of anticlimactic way, in a certain sense, right? Things are very open for the future. There's a lot of problems and limitations on all sides, and it was very limited. This thing that has been on the table for 20 years on the right, this thing they've been begging to do, we did it, and it wasn't what John McCain meant by bomb Iran. Right. John McCain wanted bomb Iran, wanted something much bigger than this. And so the rug has been pulled out from under the Iran hawks by giving them what they want, in a way.
Yeah, I think that's
it sort of was I guess you could see it as Trump kind of calling the bluff of Israel too, really. Like, here, I gave you everything that you wanted that we could possibly do. Now what?
Yeah. And it puts Republicans in a weird position where they have to kind of contradict Trump, and they have to it's just a strange moment for them where they actually are forced to choose to align with Trump over Israel, basically, or at least over Netanyahu.
At least over Netanyahu, yeah. And I think it also forces them to. I mean, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that like they were like bloodthirsty and all that, like you said, and they probably wouldn't actually mind some kind of maximalist, adventure or whatever. But it does also force them to be like, okay, look, we took care of these nuclear facilities, and by the most recent accounts, it looks like they probably did do significant damage. So what's left? If you want to say, oh, they'll reconstitute it in 2 years, we're going to have to do this again. Okay, so what do you want to do? You want to go and say it out loud. Say that you want to send our boys and girls into Tehran in tanks, and otherwise they're stuck and they have to get themselves behind Trump.
Right. I was thinking about that too, actually, because I mean, even if a ceasefire is very tenuous, what do you do then? It feels like everybody is stuck because
Absolutely.
the Iranians can have they don't have any air defense, for one. They don't have infinite ballistics either, though they have a lot. On Israel's side, again, they're going to deplete their arrows. They're going to deplete
The Iron Dome.
Yeah, that was already starting to get depleted towards the end of this. And it takes years to reconstitute all this in all reality, because it takes a while to build all those missiles, and it takes a while to accrue missiles too. And I'm sure that the Iranians would rather be buying these things secretly from the Russians and the Chinese at a later date, or once they can actually build some kind of air defense, because they don't have one now, or even because I'm sure the state is actually pretty discombobulated after what happened. Even like try to seal up a lot of the holes that they have in their intelligence and their security.
I think they certainly are. Discombobulated is probably the right term. I think that like the shakiness that maybe Israel was hoping that they could introduce into the state is probably not quite as severe as they thought. Only because I don't think this lasted long enough for the rally around the flag stuff to wear off in Iran. I think that we're going to see it in the coming weeks and months, whether the people are like, look, we need to pivot, away from these projects or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think they're definitely shaken. But I don't think it was. I don't think there feels like there's a lot of status quo available here, right? Minus some nuclear facilities, minus some arrows. There's still a lot of status quo. It feels like.
I guess that New York Times article on the UN, I think it was the UN inspector that said it might have knocked them back for years. But it's hard to say.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I don't know if we'll ever know. I mean, the thing one of the things that happened when we got out of the JCPOA, from what I've gathered, and I don't know the total veracity of this yet, that there may be one other facility that's not well known, that's even more secure than Fordo, that's deeper underground, that may have been in progress. It might not have been completed, but there may have been some uranium enrichment capacity there that was not hit, supposedly. I'm not sure how clear the picture. The other thing is if there was 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, like where is it now? Like that's an open question too, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that some of that is fog of war stuff that will become clear over time.
Right. I guess my question is, what do you do then? Like, do you bomb Iran
Right.
every 6 months? That's crazy.
It's craziness. It's craziness, and I think the other thing is that like if you do that, the notion, I mean, I don't know, maybe this is just personal, but the notion that like if you bomb Iran every 6 months or every 2 years or whatever, right? And like the Iranians, like maybe the idea is the Iranians will get tired of this, right? Or it's like I said to you in a chat, it's like you're treating the country like you're whipping a misbehaving dog. I mean, like how do you project that out into the world as a reasonable thing? No other country is treated that way.
Yeah, it would look. Yeah, no, that is odd.
Like what? I mean, it totally obliterates any notion of sovereignty.
Right, and it doesn't look credible either. I don't think for the United States
I
to be
don't
doing
think so
that.
either. Yeah.
So where does this leave, speaking of, where does this leave nuclear non-proliferation? I mean, it seems like it kind of exposes nuclear non-proliferation in some ways, or the way it works as a Western project. And if I'm a small rogue nation I don't believe anymore that I've got a bargaining chip by having half a nuclear program.
Yeah, I think that's 100% correct. I mean, if one of the things that came out of this is that we know that the JCPOA was no more, um, if Trump's able to go back to the table, I don't know if the Iranians maybe they need time. I mean, I wouldn't expect them to come back to the table anytime soon, but maybe they could get some agreement. But the other outcome here is that they walk away from the NPT, right? Uh, and they would have every incentive to do so, right? And I've said this to not just Joe, but to other people. I mean, we look at India and Pakistan as the kind of like example of where two nuclear states that have longstanding conflicts around the border and other things, Kashmir, whatever the case is, those skirmishes don't tend to get out of hand, right? I mean, mutually assured destruction it's a very effective deterrent to keeping these things limited. Um, you know,
I was kind of wondering about a comparison between the Indo-Pakistani conflicts and this, because it's unthinkable to invade Iran.
right.
But it's also kind of unthinkable to be like, oh yeah, we'll let them have a nuke. Why not?
Yeah, yeah. I don't think anybody's going to allow it, you know. I
Right.
mean, that was sort of my fantasy of like, oh, like using mutually assured destruction as like a way to stabilize things. They're going to have to do it clandestinely. I mean, and I suspect that's what they're going to attempt to do. Yeah.
Let's say they pull it off. What happens then?
That's a good question. um, what did I say to you before about that? I mean, you have a distinct possibility of having like regional stability, right? I mean, maybe the Saudis chase it after that. I don't know, but I think the main thing is that like the myth that's been proffered for why the Iranians can't have one is that they're a suicidal, maniacal, fanatical regime, right? But clearly, time and time again, we see them exercise restraint, right? um and like what would they benefit from the destruction of the total destruction of their homeland? There would be no benefit, right? So I mean, I think you would get into a situation like India and Pakistan. Maybe you have some skirmishes, maybe you have some uh, fights between regional proxies and this and that, but it would never escalate.
I guess too, Hamas is a good comparison here, actually, in terms of radicals, because
Right.
they I don't think Iran rubber stamped October 7th. I think they were aware of it, but they wanted to keep a distance from it.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, I think there's much more rationality there than is attributed to, and I think that they're a weak state. I mean, they're weak, militarily in their ability to project power. They're weak, but I think they're relatively savvy operators, for the most part. But I think that, they would have every incentive to pull out of the NPT and to, try to, pursue this program in clandestine ways.
So, what do we think this means for, well, do you want to talk about Trump's future first, or do you want to talk about the geopolitical ramifications of this for other conflicts? I mean, I think we touched on that, right? But it seemed like this very zero-sum thing, like war with Iran is World War III, and then we get this very muddled outcome instead. So is that even the slightest kind of bright spot for stuff like Taiwan, even if that's a thornier issue than this?
I
I
think
mean,
so.
we're seeing a non-zero sum outcome to this thing that has been propped up as a potential powder keg for World War III for so long.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing on that point, which is that I think one of the other things that it exposes is that the, the idea that there's some, you know, uh, ironclad alliance between China, Russia, and Iran has clearly been exposed to not be correct, right? People who have been observing that have known that for a while, that it's very much marriages of convenience, and that convenience can come and go. But I think for a long time that was the notion, that this was some kind of ironclad thing, that this was the real axis of resistance, right? As these three countries in North Korea, that's clearly been shown to be false.
Well, there's
Um,
such fear of it in the United States because it seems like it would be so powerful that it's like the anxiety leads analysts to make the quote unquote worst possible conclusion, when reality, like actually playing out the material interests of the different countries, it's not that straightforward.
I think Putin said something explicit about this, that Israel wasn't fighting us with Ukraine. They weren't arming Ukraine. So,
well, in Israel also, and that's probably pretty savvy of Israel not to get involved in that.
And another thing too that's very important, I think Israel is actually a big it's a big point for Russia to evade sanctions through. I think that they're kind of a useful go-between for Russia right now. So that's
for sanctions.
Yeah.
No, and there's a lot of Russian speakers in Israel, was something Putin pointed out.
Yeah. So Israel's like this useful go-between for.
I mean, I could be wrong about that.
No, he did say that. I wonder how much that fit into his calculus, but
I think that's a metaphor. I think saying there's a lot of Russian speakers in Israel is Putin's way of saying there's a lot of Russian interests in Israel.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
But
I think what we're seeing, like with these things, like I said, like this alliance that we projected, and I think it is a lot of like kind of American. This is like a stranded American foreign policy, which is like this kind of millenarian, prophetic thing where it's like what we're doing is what everybody's doing, right? Like we're aligned with all these states and we want to form these, and that must be what the Russians were doing. That must be what the Chinese are doing. And it's just generally not the case. But I think that what the underlying reality is this is what multipolarity looks like, right? In like a new kind of realist age, is that the sands shift, the alliances shift, they're convenient one year and they're less convenient the next year, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's what Eurasia is going to be in the 21st century.
So what does this mean for Trump?
Yeah, I mean, Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, it's hard to say.
How about that acceptance speech, huh?
Oh my God, that would be probably, it would be a work of art.
When would Iran get a bomb is my question. And when does that happen? If that happens under Trump, that does seem like a problem for him. But what can you do? How would he spin it, actually? That's my question.
He would probably spin it the way that I would spin it, which is like, look, they can't fight each other to the hilt anymore. Look, this is actually a good thing. Look, we're going to stabilize the region. Now we know we can both destroy each other, so let's stop it. Let's build some hotels. It's going to be lovely. Let's make some money, right?
Just treat them. He's got the current line from Trump is that these are fighting toddlers and they need to get it together. And that is that actually, in terms of reconfiguring, maybe not reconfiguring, but reframing aesthetically, reframing the appearance of the Israel-US relationship, I think it's more favorable than how things looked under Biden, which was very mixed. It was very easy for the common narrative of, the US is at the behest of Israel to play out under Biden because of the asleep at the wheel quality of his administration's foreign policy at all.
Yeah, it's interesting how many of these like narratives are so muddled. Even that Cy Hirsch article that you were talking about before.
That's the one thing. Yeah, Cy Hirsch has been worse and worse. I'm sorry. It's his journalism has gotten worse every article that comes out in the last few years, because you have this article where he says he has inside info that the Trump administration was preparing for a regime change war. And people have even still been touting that article like he's this prophet and all this, like because he knew that there was going to be a strike. I knew there was going to be a strike. Everybody on this call knew there was going to be a strike, okay?
We knew where the strike was going to be.
We knew where, exactly. Yeah. Iran knew where the strike was going to be because Trump was telling them exactly where it was going to be. And
they're moving the uranium out too.
And so potentially, we don't know for sure where that is, or if it was there, or if it was moved, or what. But like the thrust of the Hirsch article was that it was going to be a regime change war that John McCain would come back to life for,
right?
And that's not really what happened at all. So
well, and the thing that's funny about that is that, like, I mean, he must have claimed that he had some source or whatever telling him this, but just from our perspective, I mean, I think that we've had enough of Trump now to know that that's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. You know, like the political like capital for it, the social capital for it, it just simply does not exist.
But Bobby, to your point, I think there very well could have been people in the administration who thought they were leaking something who believed it. I
That's a
mean,
good
like
point. That's a good point.
you
No, you're
brought
right.
up you brought up all these people
Yeah.
like Ted Cruz who were going around thinking that their job right now is to start the drumbeat for a protracted Middle East conflict because that's what they want. And I'm sure there were elements within the administration that were happy to talk to Hirsch that were saying, yeah, we're getting ready to go all the way and depose the regime in Iran.
That makes
I mean,
sense.
they probably
also-
believed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder how many were also like more dovish parts of the administration that were freaking out, because I don't think that they really. I think there's a difference between Trump and Trumpism, really.
That's an interesting point, Joe, because it isn't necessarily warhawks who were talking to Hirsch who wanted it to happen. It could very well be the exact opposite.
It could have been gathered.
It could have been people within the Trump administration who were very averse to going to war, who weren't able to read the room. So we've talked about Iran, we've talked about Mamdani in our two segments. What are the overall lessons we can learn from these past few weeks in geopolitics, politics, anti-politics?
One of the lessons is you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. That's kind of how I've been feeling about this. You know, the conflict between Iran and Israel is that, like, yeah, you can't let them develop this thing, but then if you do, it's really hard to actually do anything about it. You're going to incur a loss of life and all this kind of thing. I don't know how damned if you do, damned if you don't applies to Mamdani exactly yet, but yeah, I mean the anti-political thing. I mean it opens up possibilities, right? And so in the case of Iran, Israel, I think, and Trump in particular in this case, you know, I think it opens up Trump to be able to. I mean, there's something. It's not exactly creative. I wouldn't say creative is the right word to go and, you know, bomb the nuclear facilities, but the way he kind of pulled the rug out, especially not just from the GOP but from Israel, there's something creative about that, right? And I think him being just outside, I mean, totally outside of the foreign policy blob allows him to have that kind of maneuverability, right? And I think that's the lesson of like this kind of anti-political mood is when you have somebody who understands that he can operate without these sort of influences that, you know, Biden was very much a part of that, right? Anthony Blinken was very much a part of that, and so you just get more of the same with them, and even like you said, they were asleep at the wheel on top of it. You know, the anti-political mood allows for some flexibility and some maneuverability. I think that Trump, you know, took advantage of.
I mean, you mentioned Blinken. I can't help but quote Joe on this. Could you believe that Marco Rubio would be a less destructive Secretary of State than Anthony Blinken 10 years ago, if you heard that?
It's insane.
Yeah, no, I would be. That does feel like an acid dropping moment, honestly. But
because Blinken came out a day or two ago, and Blinken came out and he was saying, "Oh, we didn't do enough damage to the nuclear facilities." Okay, let's say to all of the people who are saying we didn't do enough damage to the nuclear facilities, okay, say it. Say what you want.
Say it.
Just tell us you want to bomb more stuff.
Yeah,
tell us
exactly.
you want to bomb more shit.
Yeah.
Just be honest. Just be honest. Because that's what else would you be doing by adding that to the discourse other than saying we should hit them again? I mean, I guess it's trying to get a pot shot in against Trump.
Yeah, but I think it's both. I think it's definitely both. Yeah.
But yeah, just to speak to the overall point, I mean, if we're looking at how does anti-politics affect war, well, there's obviously exceptions, right? Where states just find it enough in their interest to, or they have very specific arrangements with their public, like you see with Gaza, for example, where they are able to act a little bit more with impunity. But those are the exceptions to the rule, really, in terms of how difficult it is to mobilize for war today. And you see all of these things, like the way anti-politics is able to influence politics. It's not necessarily that all of these people in politics who act anti-politically are like pillars of anti-politics themselves. They're not necessarily all like thinking that that's what they're doing. Instead, anti-politics is like a material constraint on them. And so that is one of the ways that it is the even when it doesn't coalesce into organized movements, the way that it, as a secular trend, anti-politics is the real movement of society today.
Right.
Mamdani's not an anti-politician, but anti-politics is driving the events, right, in ways that are smashing the Democratic Party establishment.
Right. And I guess the question for him is like, does he write it or does he not?
Right.
If he doesn't write it, he's going to have a tough time.